Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for EEA's Education Series webinar. Today, we'll be taking a deep dive into the EEA Community Projects. Today's call is being recorded and will be available to all attendees soon after today's presentation. The EEA is a member-led industry organization whose objective is to drive the use of Enterprise Ethereum and Mainnet Ethereum blockchain technology as an open standard to empower all enterprises. We welcome any and everyone to join and become a part of our global community. At this time, I'm pleased to introduce our moderator, Dan Burnett.
Hi, and welcome. So my name is Dan Burnett, as Brittany said. I'm the Executive Director of the EEA, and I'm very pleased to have with me today Guy Martin, the Executive Director of OASIS Open. Hello, Guy.
Hey, Dan, great to be here with you.
Great to have you. So this is going to be much less formal than most of our education series webinars. Essentially, Guy and I are just going to talk, and we're going to be talking about the EEA community projects. But before we get into that, I thought we could start off with introductions of ourselves. Obviously, the two of us know each other, but I think for the purposes of this discussion, it would be really helpful for each of us to go into our backgrounds in more detail than we usually do. So I think that that ended up relevant in the conversations that we had. Let's see. I'll go ahead and start since I'm talking. So let's see. I have an undergraduate degree in mathematics and a PhD in computer science. So this was using neural networks to do speech recognition. So my original technical love was machine learning, and that's still a big part of my my private reading is in machine learning and how that works today. I actually worked for a number of large and small companies, but the interesting part for me in my career was when I worked for Nuance, which was a startup company in 1999 in the San Francisco Bay Area. So this is during the dot-com boom time. I actually got started working on a standard called Voicexml, which was used to, it's basically a standard for interactive voice response systems, essentially the automated phone answering systems that we all get whenever you call somebody, okay? But this was the first time there was a standard for that, and it turns out that it was actually the first really broadly accepted standard for speech recognition systems. And it's still widely, widely used today. But when I got started, I thought maybe I'd be doing research. So I went to one of these meetings at W3C where they were working on this, the World Wide Web Consortium, and I actually went there to tell them that the direction they were pursuing was not any good. And I learned better. What happened when I showed up was I realized that number one, that standard was going to happen. And number two, we really needed to be part of it. And that was really my introduction to standards work. I remember some of the early conversations there where about, HTML, right? So HTML was a big step backwards for the desktop publishing community, but it was a big step forwards for the world, okay? And that's how I feel about Voicexml and in some cases, some of the other standards that we worked on. In any case, so that's how I got started. I got started working on Voicexml, then worked for a number of companies, a lot of startups. So basically, for more than 20 years now, I've been doing web and internet standards. Two others more recently are WebRTC, which underlies almost all of the peer-to-peer video communications apps we use today and have been relying on during the pandemic. Also, verifiable credentials and decentralized identifiers. That's something that I've been heavily involved with since about 2014 as one of the original editors of the verifiable credentials work and the co-chair of the working group at W3C that developed both verifiable credentials and decentralized identifiers. You're going to be hearing more about that over time. But I think the key for me is that I've done an awful lot of standards in a world that was fairly open, where people could see the work that was happening, where it took a while to get things done, but there were good reasons for doing those standards, and ultimately they helped the industries that they were in.
Cool.
Yeah, maybe you can tell us about your background, Guy.
Well, it's fascinating, Dan. I mean, we've talked for 10 plus months. People should know we've been working on the this EEA Community Projects effort for about 10 plus months. And I've learned things in your introduction. I didn't know you had a PhD in computer science, and now I know who to blame every time we call and we get that sometimes annoying voice response system that sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. Exactly. You don't want to hear that. Hey, everybody. I'm Guy Martin, and like Dan, I actually kind of started my career as a software engineer. I have a computer science undergraduate. And really, the first half of my career was really defined by being an engineer in everything from embedded all the way to the enterprise Java beans and server types of things. I was at Sun when Java was invented. I can't take credit for that, but I was there when it was invented, got to sit down the hall from James Gosling, which was kind of cool. But I think really the second half of my career, I like to say now that I'm just an engineer that writes IoT code that annoys my poor partner when the lights in the house don't work. But the second half of my career has really been spent around helping companies understand open source. And I started contributing to open source kind of early on in my software engineering career, and found that I was going to be a serviceable engineer. I call it a serviceable engineer, right? I was never going to be the world's next Linus Torvalds or James Gosling, but I could explain to people from the business side why technology was important, how to speak to engineers, how to bridge those two communities. And so that's really where I've spent the latter half of my career, helping build open source program offices for companies like Red Hat, Samsung, most recently Autodesk. And when I applied for the role here at OASIS Open, it was interesting. It was an interesting time at OASIS because we've been traditionally known as an SDO or a standards development organization, but there's really been a focus and a change around let's find a way to do what I'm calling harmonize open source and open standards, because I did have an experience as a traditional engineer. I kind of for a long time thought standards were, oh God, we got to do a standard, right? And we're gonna do a death march 18 month type of effort. But what I found when I was at Samsung, we were working with Intel on a standard which was called OIC, and now it's called OCF, Open Connectivity Framework. Basically, a thin layer that abstracts the it's not surprisingly IoT wireless technologies, thin layer that abstracts that. But we started it as both an open source project and a standard. And the standard's gone through JTC1 now and has been submitted to ISO. But what was interesting in that experience is I found that these two communities, the open standards community, the open source community, really weren't that far apart, right? And I think as an engineer, the time that I grew up as an engineer, I kind of thought, oh, they're very different communities. But in thinking a lot more about it in that experience and seeing these two camps, the open source camp and the open standards camp, really find a way to come together and work on something that became OCF, I saw that there was a lot of value there. And in reality, I also saw that, if you go back to when the internet started, it was common standards with open implementations. It wasn't called open source back then, but it was basically what we're all relying on now, not unlike the WebRTC things, is the combination of open source and open standards working together effectively. And so I really believe that is the mission I have at OASIS, is to remind those open standards and open source communities that they're not that different after all, that there's really value in trying to harmonize those efforts where it makes sense. So it's in that vein that Dan and I started our conversations about 10 and a half months ago around what a partnership between OASIS Open and EEA would look like around Ethereum. So that's where we are today.
Wonderful, wonderful, thank you. So before we, well, of course, the news, right? The news is that, and we announced this in June, I think it was, that the Ethereum OASIS Open Project was becoming the EEA Community Projects. And I think it's important in this webinar, we have a chance to talk deeply about why that was important and why we wanted to do that. So as Guy mentioned, we started talking quite a number of months ago, and so there were a number of reasons. One of the reasons, actually, maybe before we even get into that, could you just say a little bit about the open projects? Because
sure,
if you talk about open projects, and then I can talk about like how this work started, because I think I think it started before you joined OASIS.
It did, actually. So
Yeah.
what's interesting is that, as I mentioned, OASIS was traditionally known as an SDO, or Standards Development Organization, right? So we have what we call our traditional technical communities process, which I know you've been a part of, Dan, right? So communities coming together, organizations coming together, and then most of the output, the vast majority of the output of our standards are open, right? So no charge for implementation, royalty free for the most part. And so that kind of process led to then them saying, well, wait a minute, being able to take open source and being able to start an open source project and give it a path to international de jure recognition through ISO, ITU, et cetera, was a valuable thing, right? And I think OASIS began to realize that, and other folks have realized this, right? There's other places that now do this as well. But really, Open Projects was one of the first of these kinds of efforts to figure out how you take open source projects, put on some amount of governance from a little bit more strict governance kind of from the standard side, but still keep an iterative process and let an open source project come in, work within the governance model that we have at OASIS, and then be able to be taken through to an OASIS standard and potentially further on to, again, one of those de jure standards bodies. So it's really the product offering that we have that kind of addresses the open source side and helps you take something through to standards.
Yeah, and that was really the value. I mean, one of the big values that I saw, that prompted me to reach out to you. So the Ethereum OASIS Open Project, when it was originally formed, so that was a couple years ago. So what happened was, and I'm speaking now to those in the Ethereum community who would recognize some of the names and so on. Virgil Griffith had reached out to Charles Neville and to a couple of others about the need for some additional standards work that might be more acceptable to enterprises. And in particular, he was looking at the JSON RPC APIs and the fact that there wasn't really a standard. It wasn't clearly written down what they were. These are the APIs that are used to interact with clients on the Ethereum network. And so, he looked at a number of different options, and in the end, actually, was really very excited about OASIS and the structure that OASIS had, and for that. And so, he was representing the Ethereum Foundation at the time. I was representing ConsenSys, and Charles Neville was representing the EEA. And so the three of us got together and formed the Ethereum OASIS Open Project. And we specifically wrote it. Charles Neville and I both have a background with web and internet standards. And we specifically wrote the governance document to basically encourage standards development, but exactly the way that you're describing, Guy. So that open source, completely open projects that had been done, in some cases without any governance at all, would then have a place where they could come in and proceed towards a standard that got, that added progressively more rigor as necessary. And in fact, when we started it, we actually worked very hard to keep the governance as light as we could, because we knew that rigor needed to be added, but we didn't want to start with the immense amount of process that, OASIS has, W3C has, et cetera. So that started a couple years ago. The baseline project came in a year ago, and that was really when things got moving. Obviously, many people are familiar with baseline protocol. A lot of great work that's been happening there. It's just really phenomenal, the results that we're seeing from that. But I think it was a great first example of the kind of work that this project was intended to do. And that was an open source project that got to a point of growth where it realized that they wanted to have other implementations as well. There needed to be more than just the code. The code is important, very important, but you need to go beyond that at some point if you want to have other implementations that will be interoperable with you, whether they are just open source implementations in other programming languages, or whether they're proprietary implementations, perhaps.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, and I think the thing that I'm excited both about this effort as well as just generally when I came to OASIS is we're actually at some point going to, I don't want to say merge, but sort of unify the kind of the TC side of the house, the technical community side of the house, and the open project side of the house, because in reality, I think that the model that we kind of came up with OIC, OCF way back when of, you know, having both, right, whether it starts from the code side or whether it starts from the standard side, open projects gives us that ability and that flexibility. And you mentioned kind of, you know, the governance model. We've designed open projects to actually have a fairly flexible governance structure so that you can figure out what it needs to be. It has enough rigor and enough structure that, you know, we can legitimately take something that comes out of that and take it to an ISO or an ITU, but we're not trying to impose kind of a heavyweight structure from the beginning. But that flexibility of governance and being able to start either from a standard side, right, from the prose and the word side, or start from the code side is really, really valuable.
Right. It was, again, it was particularly appealing to me when I joined the EEA. So at the time I mentioned ConsenSys. I was with ConsenSys for the 2 years before I joined EEA last year. And, you know, and we had watched the baseline work, just very exciting. For me, it was an example when I joined the EEA of projects in the Ethereum space that are going to begin this way. Many projects in the Ethereum space begin as open source projects. Mm-hmm. In fact, they start as one person writing some code, eventually becomes an open source project, grows from there. And what was interesting to me was that this was actually different from how I had seen folks get to the standards path in my career. So the traditional path for standards or getting to a standard is where you have a number of companies that all have their own implementations of something, and either they or their customers demand a standard, essentially. And so what happens is you now have a number of proprietary implementations whose code you will never see that need to interoperate. And so then you start a standard, you write the standard, you write a test suite, everyone runs their implementation against the test suite to prove that there's some chance of interoperability. Eventually, maybe you go to an interop fest, right, where you actually demonstrate that even further. But the key here is that the standard is written so that no one implementation counts as the only official implementation. And it's interesting is if you think about Ethereum, right? Ethereum, by definition, is whatever the clients implement today. Okay, there is a yellow paper, but Ethereum today is just whatever the clients happen to implement. And I remember speaking with one of the core devs at one point who said, yes, that is exactly the case. We have actually had to replicate some bugs in the other clients in order to interoperate properly. So this is a great example of where it's good to have source code, but the source code may not, you know, it may be that that's not the ideal, you know, canonical definition of how things should work. Mm. So let's see. So that's how we got started on the work. Right. So at the EA, I wanted to start, you know, when I came in, one of the things I wanted to do was to better connect the EEA to the broader community. I wanted to broaden the tent of the EEA in terms of who we have as members, the geographies that we're connected with, the variety of applications and, you know, member applications that we would you know, interact with in some way. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to have an ability for a more visible and more community involvement for work that was appropriate for, particularly the work that began as open source software. And so I reached out to Guy, and what happened next?
Let's see. You reached out to me, and I said, "Wow, this is exactly in line with why I came to OASIS. Right? Is to figure out again this harmonization of open source and open standards." And I think we really thought then at that point that we had a chance with the Enterprise Ethereum community to build a bigger tent. Right? I mean, we use that analogy a lot to figure out how we take both the work that starts, as you mentioned, kind of from the standard side, but also how we take the work that starts from the open source side, which you can argue which has probably got more more volume or how much work is coming in from either side, but it's kind of irrelevant, because if you kind of had two different camps and they weren't really talking to each other, it was going to be as challenging as you mentioned with kind of trying to replicate bugs in different clients. Having a place where the entire Enterprise Ethereum community can come under one umbrella and start their project however it makes the most sense, right? So if it makes more sense to start it, if you've got companies that have proprietary implementations and they want to start a standard, they can do it with you folks at EEA. But if there's an open source piece of code that is going to be valuable to the Enterprise Ethereum community at some point, being able to start it in under that EEA Community Projects umbrella, kind of on the community-led side, is really, really important as well.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out, that we haven't dropped the past work that we were known for, right? So now what the EEA has is member-led or member-directed projects and community-led community projects. And so both are fine, and we 100% support both directions, whichever is most appropriate for the particular project. I wanted to make a comment. You mentioned Enterprise Ethereum, and so I'm gonna I just want to comment on that just a little bit. When the EEA started as the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, we often talked about Enterprise Ethereum, and we still do today. Enterprise Ethereum is essentially, sort of private permissioned use of Ethereum technologies, or at least that's how we initially talked about it. And so the EEA has some specifications that talk about how those, private deployments, consortium deployments of the Ethereum network should operate or should interoperate with others. But I think in this call, for the most part, when we talk about Enterprise Ethereum, we're going to talk about it in a broader sense. It's basically enterprise use of Ethereum or business use of Ethereum. So I just wanted to explain that for our audience. As a shortcut, we'll sometimes say Enterprise Ethereum, but what we're referring to is all business use of Ethereum, whether it's on mainnet or anything else.
Right. And I think that's a great point to make, Dan. And I mean, and then you think about what comes out of things like Baseline, right? The ability to verify transactions that are on those private nets with data on the main net, where you're not exposing some of the private details, but you're using that as the mechanism. I think it's a great example.
That's right. As the public utility, as John Whelan, the EEA's board chairman, likes to say, is that the Ethereum mainnet is essentially a public utility. You pay a little bit of a transaction fee to use it, but it's there. You don't have to set it up. It's already there. So we've been talking about Ethereum because, of course, this is an EEA webinar. But one of the other things that I was excited about when we were first talking, and I think you were excited about as well, was the opportunities that this provided for OASIS. That this, what we did was essentially one example of a broader opportunity for OASIS.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that, Dan, because really it's, and I think it was John Whelan, speaking of John, who coined the term managed open project. So one of the things that we should point out to the audience is that we did change the name from the Ethereum OASIS Open Project to EEA Community Projects. But the full official legal, as it goes to ITU, excuse me, or ISO potentially name, is EEA Community Projects and OASIS Managed Open Project. So we've had this concept of open projects that we talked about. What John and you and we all came up with was this notion of a managed open project, which allows all the same governance structure. So we should point out for the audience, none of the governance changed. Matter of fact, John Whelan has said the governance is sacrosanct for how the OASIS Open Project, this open project works, but it allows us to extend branding rights to organizations like the EEA and find a way to do something that I'd been trying to do as I came into OASIS in my first 8 to 10 months, is really say, hey, the value we have in both the governance model, how we do open projects, and our relationships with de jure bodies and how we can take standards through and verify that they've met our process and, kind of have our stamp of approval that the ISOs and ITUs and IETFs, value. Having a managed open project construct is going to allow us to do this for other organizations. And so, we're not going to announce anything on this call. We've got some thoughts that we're and things that we're pursuing with that. But I really think this was a great example, kind of exhibit A of a new category of product offering that we can have at OASIS that allows us to take our standards expertise and actually translate that and make it available to other nonprofits that maybe don't have that, but can utilize it from what we do.
Yeah, I'm this was really important. It was really, really important. I've had people ask me if this is just a name change. And I feel like saying, well, no, I mean, we could, the EEA could have tried to build this out for itself.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
But it doesn't make sense to do that. OASIS has a great reputation here. And with your open source background and the tremendous, deep knowledge that you have there on how to do that right and how to integrate well, with all of that, it just did not make sense for us to do that. So essentially, what you may be doing with other organizations is, if there's an alliance in some other space and they have a need for this kind of work,
Right.
you can essentially run it for them. And that is what you were doing for us. This is how we likely would have set it up from the beginning, had we had this as an opportunity. It's a real benefit, actually, that OASIS is running this. But it's also nice that for us, this is part of the EEA, and we do think of it that way, right? This is a piece of the EEA. Our marketing departments are talking about it as such. Our staff is thinking about it that way.
Right.
And that's, I think, really important for the Ethereum industry as well. As Ethereum matures, we are going to see more and more need for proper standardization. I think I'll just leave it at that. I don't want to give too many examples of that yet, but I expect that within the next 6 months to a year, we're going to see a number of new efforts begin around standardization in the Ethereum space. This will help not just with business adoption, but it will help. I mean, just to be timely, right? If you look at conversations that are happening in the U.S. Congress now, around what how you need to work with the various cryptocurrencies and networks.
Yeah.
A lot of what's happening, and the same thing happened at the beginning of the internet. Okay, the exact same thing happened, when I was in that .com boom. Okay, and living in the San Francisco Bay Area, is that regulators don't know what to do yet. They're still learning. Okay, and they're experimenting. They're trying things. One of the things that will really help them is for us to be able to develop some high quality standards in this space. That is another demonstration of a desire for maturity and an actual increase in maturity in the space that will be needed. There's something that you had mentioned to me. I'm trying to remember exactly what it was. There's a comment you had wanted to make, I know, Guy, since I was talking about the maturation of Ethereum and about standards being a part of that.
Right.
There's a comment you had wanted to make about a tie between open source and open standards and where you think that's headed, and sort of along this idea of maturation of both Ethereum as a technology. I think you kind of see a future vision for where standards and open source, how they can benefit each other and why.
Right. I mean, I think it kind of goes back to what I've been saying, basically since I've been here at OASIS, is not only that harmonization of open source and open standards, but almost a back to the future kind of thing, right? Where again, the beginning of the internet, where you had open standards that were implemented with open implementations, kind of pre-open source days, if you will, that we now, I think, need to get to this space in a lot of different technology domains, right? Cryptology is one of them. Cryptocurrency is one of them. We're already starting to see some of this in cloud and other technology areas, but really this notion that, it's all about one code base, like you said, Dan, it's all about one code base and one code base to rule them all, is just, I think, I used to think that way. Quite honestly, I used to think that way as an engineer. Right? We got this one code base, everyone's going to use it, it's going to be great. The more I sort of got exposed to the larger enterprise space, to the larger business space, and to the larger regulatory space, where you have governments, you've got big enterprises that are like, you know what, we have a need to have a different implementation, right? And we have to have interoperability. I think that the domains that we're going to have interoperability are only increasing, right? And you look at the timeliness of what's happened with COVID and everybody now relying on, and us, being isolated, but still connected as a society. We're going to find a way to bring those open source and open standards communities closer together. And so as I've kind of been thinking about being involved in both a little bit, kind of more on the standards side now than I was in the open source side, I've looked at things like, hey, can we do checkpoints in the process development of both open source, open standards to figure out, okay, hey, let's just have a conversation, right? Here's where the open source project is going. How does that inform the standard? And so a lot of this that we did in OIC, OCF was around figuring out, okay, what's leading, right? At some point, one's going to be leading, one's going to be lagging. It's rare that they're both exactly equal. But I think what we found in OIC and OCF was if we took some of the best practices from each community, right? So from the standard side, kind of a more rigor or more governance. From the open source side, kind of that iterative innovation approach, and figured out a way to marry those in a unique way. Now, it's not easy, right? I say that as if, yeah, we just snap our fingers and it's done, but it's not, right? As still someone who is an engineer and has an engineer brain and gets frustrated by, oh God, we got to talk about all these things in standards. The reality is I think about the longer term picture. And I think that's what I would encourage kind of both communities to think about is what is the longer term picture together, the open standards and open source communities, because if they continue to try to do things each on their own, I think they're actually not going to have as much impact as if they figured out a way to come together, use the standards should be iterating a little bit more quickly. Open source projects should have a little bit more stringent governance and have a longer term view of interoperability so that you kind of get to a point where you've kind of got the best of both worlds.
This is particularly relevant for the governance that we set up for this project. I know Charles and I were very, very insistent that we have the most critical parts of the governance, but no more than that, right? We wanted essentially just-in-time governance, right? We wanted an ability to make sure that that in the end the right things have occurred, but ideally without a lot of slow vote taking and all of that kind of stuff, because it really does decrease the audience, and
right.
the participation in the
Right.
work. And what makes something valuable, what makes a standard valuable, is broad participation. I always say if it's just you, it's not a standard, right?
Exactly.
And so you really have to get others involved. When you get groups of people together, they don't agree, but that doesn't mean that you can't actually have some faster iterations along the way.
Right.
You just need to make sure that you're not throwing anyone under the bus consistently as you go, right? So there are things
Right.
like that to watch out for. So we've been, I was going to say innovating, we've been experimenting. I don't know if it's innovation, it's innovative, but we've been experimenting a little bit with the governance that we put on this particular project. But I think this is the direction of the future, is some kind of hybrid of the two, where we can get the faster iteration.
Right.
Speaking of governance, you mentioned that the governance didn't change. I think we should probably talk about that a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
The EEA member projects have a certain governance that they follow, and that's sort of the traditional way the EEA has done it. But we really didn't change anything for the EEA community projects, right? I mean, we didn't change that at all. And I think that's important for people to understand here. And you said a little bit about that, but could you maybe say a little bit more about why the rules that were used for the open project, which are now used for this managed open project, are so important?
Well, I mean, I think it goes to something that interestingly is coming up in timely. If anybody has seen the announcement from GitHub for their minimum viable governance model that they put together, we actually looked at that when it came out and we said, wow, it looks surprisingly, we're not accusing anybody of anything, but it looks surprisingly like what our project rules look like for a traditional open project. And we actually think that's great, right? Because to your point, Dan, it's the minimum amount of governance that you need, but not any more than that, but also the flexibility to say, hey, if you need to change the charter or if you need to sort of adjust the way these things work, you can do it, but it does require project governing board to vote on that. So it's not kind of the Wild West, but it has that flexibility, but again, a little bit more rigor around IP, a little bit more rigor around sort of, what the participation model looks like. And I think it's, one of the things that I looked at when I came into OASIS was what was the open projects governance model. And, I like that it was kind of the bicameral model of, you've got the project governing board, which is organizations who have sponsored the work. But by and large, the technical steering committee work happens by people doing the work, right? And that they can be members of employees of people who are on the project governing board, but they don't have to be, right? The technical steering committee can and should be people who are actually involved in the day-to-day work, making strategic decisions about what goes forward from a technical standpoint in that project, with the project governing board kind of giving the oversight to the longer term view of what this project or what these projects are going to mean for enterprises that are sponsoring the work. But even more important is that what comes out of it is open, right? I mean, it's the drum I have been banging on basically my entire career, that the notion of, you know, I won't mention specific SDOs that charge for implementation or charge the royalties, you know, for things are just not, it's not a model I think that works anymore. And so having things where companies come together, pay the money up front to actually develop this thing, but then it's open and available for anyone to implement is really, really important. And so the fact that we didn't change any of that, the fact that, you know, you folks came in, said, hey, yes, we will make a larger contribution to helping, you know, this EEA community projects come together, but that anybody can still participate, right? You don't need to be an OASIS member to participate. You don't need to be an EEA member to participate. If you want to sponsor, if your company wants to sponsor the work, great. You can come in, get a seat on the project governing board, have a say in sort of how those things work. But it's a regular open source project from every other perspective. Anybody can come and participate, and we actually welcome that. And I think it's an important point that it gives people a chance to participate, even if they're not members of either of our organizations.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that. That's critically important here, that you really don't have to be a member of any organization. You do have to sign a contributor license agreement. And I think most people understand that, but it's probably worth just saying a few words about that. You know, there's a reason that there are agreements like this, okay? Whether it's a member agreement within the EEA, member directed work, or whether it's in the community projects. The reason that we have license agreements and specifically around contributions is to ensure that the work remains open and freely implementable. That's critically unencumbered. That's right, critically important for implementers to be able to use it. I should point out that we are completely in alignment on this. And when you're talking about specifications that you don't have to pay for, the actual specification itself, the resulting document, you know, the EEA documents are also all publicly available, the standards that we create, right? They're created by members, but they're all made public. There's no charge to use them. That is a really old model. I think IETF and W3C both did away with that a number of years ago, and other organizations have done that as well. It just feels wrong to have to pay to see a specification to be able to implement it. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, we do have a question that came up. Can you address the transaction privacy management layer? I believe it comes from OASIS into EEA and its direction with Orion, Tessera, and Constellation for Besu and Quorum. I think that's a question for you, Dan.
Yeah, I saw that one. So that particular, okay, so if you're talking about, well, you are talking about the privacy management layer. So those pieces are pieces that implement or are compatible with the EEA's Enterprise Ethereum core specifications, okay? And that was work that was done and continues to be done on the member-led side. So that's not part of anything that's been done on the OASIS side. Now, Besu is an open source implementation that is hosted and run at Hyperledger. And so, so if you want to participate in the development of Besu, then Hyperledger is where you would go for that. But Besu, like Quorum, do comply with the EEA standards. So that work, I'm happy to talk with you. I noticed you sent a, I think we could talk about that offline maybe, because I think you had sent to me that you're gonna just connect to me. So we can talk more about that. That's not really connected with this particular OASIS, partnership. But the interesting thing about that is that, Besu was open source, right? And so let's say that that work had instead started. Well, actually, I guess Quorum did too. If you start with an open source project, it might be that the community projects would be the direction you would want to go. We want you to bring the work to us. I think that's the thing that's most important to me, is that you bring the work and we will help you figure out where it should go.
Yeah, that's a great point, Dan, because we've talked a lot about this. So when we say bring us the work, we mean bring the work to either Dan or myself, and we have no compunction about going, yeah, it's not right for us. You need to go to the member-led side of EEA, and if something comes in to the member-led side of EEA that you think is a better fit for the community, OASIS or the EEA Community Project side, we'll direct it that way. I think that's the big thing I want people to understand about this partnership, is that we see value, and as in any partnership, you've got to get to a point where you see value for both organizations, right? And I've clearly sort of hopefully laid out why it's important to OASIS. I mean, I think you have, Dan, have talked a little bit about why it's important to EEA, but do you want to kind of highlight a little bit more about why EEA thinks it's so important to have this work kind of in conjunction and partnership with us?
Yes. So number one, OASIS has a really good reputation for the work that it produces, and there's the work that is done at OASIS itself, and then there's the well-trodden path that OASIS has established towards organizations like ISO, ITU, etc. And this is really important. It's not something that the Ethereum community is paying attention to yet, okay? But if you talk with any larger enterprises, which eventually will need to be adopting the standards that we're going to be developing, they often have mandates, either from governments or from their suppliers, that say, you must implement a standard that is approved by ISO, for example. So it's really, really important to have a path for that. And OASIS has a really well-established path there that I think is particularly valuable. Additionally, the work had already begun, right? And was clearly, I think it was doing, the baseline protocol in particular was doing a good job of demonstrating what a community project should look like.
Yeah.
That there's more coming. We just had a project governing board meeting right before this webinar, and there's some really good announcements coming up within the next few months around baseline, and so it's just really exciting to see all of the work that's happening there. So from our perspective, we wanted to see a tent, a place for Ethereum standardization work to happen. And Guy, you might not like me saying this, but an open source project someone can actually do anywhere. All you need is a GitHub repo.
Exactly.
Okay.
No,
it doesn't require. It doesn't actually require any formal process to get started. Right. Now, exactly. you may hate life later on if you don't follow proper processes. Okay.
Right.
So there are some learnings that have been made over the years, right? But the truth is that you don't need this in order to just do an open source project. But if you want to do it right, if you want to have a path towards standardization, then this is a great way to do it. And that's something that we did not have. The EEA did not have a way for someone who had created a piece of source code and wanted to develop a standard from it to do so.
Right. I mean, and I think, yeah, first of all, I won't hate you for saying that, as an engineer and as somebody who sees this and sees what happens, where I was just on a thread in a thing that I'm a part of, the foundations, FLOSS Foundations for open source email list. There was a lot of thing about, gosh, why foundations? And they're so problematic and they're so heavyweight and they can be. And I think we try not to be, at least at OASIS, we try to be kind of big enough to matter, small enough to care, right? Not some gargantuan thing that's going to enforce a ton of unnecessary process. But you made a great point, which is you get to a point from a maturation standpoint where you want to go to another country, right? We're very US centric, we're very North American centric sometimes, but OASIS has a great reputation internationally, right? We just have started the OASIS Open Europe Foundation, right? To have an international or a European focused part of our organization. And when you get to some of these governments, especially in Europe, they want standards, right? They want that ability to have multiple implementations because it's really important from a competition standpoint and for them to feel like they're not locked in. And so I think that, again, that one source code to rule them all model sometimes can work. It depends on the technology area you're in. But I think more and more, again, we're going to see this sort of the larger society and the larger government and enterprise space saying, hey, you know, that's just not viable, right? We need to have multiple implementations. We need, even if they don't have them yet, we need the option to have multiple implementations. We need to have interoperability. And then, you know, this just actually, there was a critical example in cybersecurity, right? It's not Ethereum, but just if you look at cybersecurity, right? There's the NIS2 directive in Europe around, you know, helping software supply chain. There's President Biden's executive order around software supply chain. And what kind of came out of that, just from a larger technology context, is you've got proprietary implementations. I know some of my much more free and open source friends are going to be like, oh, proprietary, everything's bad. The reality is it's out there. And
right.
Finding a way to interoperate between open source implementations and proprietary implementations is not going away. And a good way to do that is with standards that you participate in developing in this open fashion.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is the world, okay? The proprietary implementations, not only are they not going away, but they actually, well, okay, I won't say that they will grow. I mean, obviously we're seeing lots of open source movement by many organizations, but there are a variety of reasons for proprietary implementations. They're not all bad, but interoperability is always a good thing. Mm-hmm. It benefits everyone when it basically, it is a tide that lifts all boats when you build a standard and you have an industry that adopts it broadly. It allows everyone to begin to move up the stack and focus on, you know, the new innovations that, you know, that are coming. So, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the international connection too. Internationally, I've seen that as well as in my career, that particularly Europe, also portions of Asia, we see much stronger interest in and adoption of standards than in the US. It's like the US is late sometimes to do it, but definitely in other regions of the world, we see it much more rapidly. The EEA also is a global organization. We would like to be even more involved globally than we are. So we are working on that. We held our first Asia-focused event, Asia-Pacific focused event last December. I think we're looking at trying to do another one this year as well. We're going to be doing I'm pretty sure a Europe-focused one before too long. That we may wait until we can do that one in person next year.
Yeah.
So I know exactly. We all want to do in-person events.
Yeah, in person, this would be nice.
Yes. And international in person, that's really important for us. One of the reasons we haven't held events like that is we did not want them just to be US events or just North America events. Right. You know, there's some events coming up in the US that are Ethereum focused and they're wonderful, but the folks from Europe can't attend. And I think that's unfortunate. And, right. You know, similarly for the events that they have there. Right. I want to make sure we get to how people get involved. Maybe you were about to say that as well.
No, I think we're right in sync. Go ahead.
Right. So, you know, as we mentioned, to actually participate in the EEA community projects, you don't need to be a member of anything. There are no fees, nothing like that. What I'd like to do is ask Brittany to drop a link. This is a link to the EEA's page. Thank you. For the EEA community projects. And from there, you can get to the various pieces of work. We do have right now 2 major projects, the JSON RPC documentation work and the baseline project, as we mentioned. Baseline has a lot of, there's just so much happening with baseline that I'll just point out, I asked for this beforehand, right? So there's a, let's see, there's a standards working session that's weekly on Thursdays. The steering committee is every other week on Monday. I'm sorry, it's once a month on a Monday. And then the project governing board for the overall EEA community projects meets every other week on Wednesday. Now, we should talk about the difference between those. So for the standards work, just basically you just show up, right? Show up and participate, begin contributing. You'll need to actually give someone there your GitHub ID, and then they can get you in, so you can contribute. You have to sign the contributor license agreement and so on. But it's pretty, I think it's pretty straightforward to do that. Now, if you would like to be sort of leading okay? And that's where you get into the technical steering committee. The members of the technical steering committee for the baseline protocol work are chosen from the contributors. And that's on purpose, okay? You notice I didn't say from the payers, right? This is literally from the contributors. And that's the way that project was set up. It was so that the only people who are the ones who get to say what goes in are the people who are doing the work of making a contribution. If you can't function in GitHub, you really shouldn't be on the committee that's deciding what goes in, you know, on GitHub. Now, so again, all of that is about contributions. If you would like to support the work, there's a different process, and Guy, maybe I'll let you talk to that.
Yeah, so if you want to support the work, becoming an OASIS Open Project sponsor of this managed open project, you can go to our website. I should have gotten the link. I'll try to see if I can drop it in there. But you can become a project sponsor. Your organization can become a project sponsor, and you then will have one seat on the project governing board that Dan mentioned earlier. So the board that kind of decides sort of the overall strategic direction, you know, going forward, figures out how the money gets spent for the sponsorship dollars, et cetera. And then you can be part of that that body that does that work. Let me go find that link for you real quick.
Right. I think you can get there from this link, but it would be better for you to have a direct link as well for those who want to sponsor. Again, you don't have to participate in the work. The EEA is supporting this, and I will say, you know, if you're a member of the EEA, thank you. The EEA is itself supporting this work because we believe it's important. But if there's a particular piece of work that you want to more directly support, then this is the way to do it, by being a sponsor of the EEA Community Projects, and that's through OASIS, because OASIS is running it, right? You know, we're just completely open and transparent about this, right? OASIS is doing the work of running this, so they're the ones who would need the sponsorship dollars for that particular work. For the EEA member-led projects, it is EEA staff that's doing the work, and so, you know, the membership dollars are needed to support that. So if you don't know which to do, contact either one of us and we'll help you, again, figure out where the right place is. You know, we want to see the ecosystem grow, and that is something that I've been so pleased working with you, Guy, just how positive this whole conversation has been, and how much in alignment we've been, that this really is a win-win situation here. Because if we grow the Ethereum ecosystem, if we help businesses make better use of Ethereum overall, that helps all of us. That helps the EEA, that helps Ethereum, that helps OASIS, that helps you when you go to someone else and say, look at what we did here. We have actually helped, you know, this whole Ethereum ecosystem grow. Yeah, Ethereum, that Ethereum, the one you've heard about, right? Right. So anyway, just I have to say thank you for that. Because that's just been a wonderful aspect of this process.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that, Dan, and same to you. I mean, this has been, I think, from us on the OASIS side, you know, we've always appreciated your contributions as the chair of the project governing board for you know, now EEA Community Projects, but also just this notion of the fact that you were in alignment. You understood that we had value that was already built that you didn't have to build, and that we could have a really positive discussion about what it looked like for both organizations. One thing I would like, if we have a few more minutes here, is for you, kind of from your seat, both at EEA and on the project governing board. Obviously, you can't make any announcements, but what areas do you think, or have you heard, might possibly come to this EEA Community Projects, other than the work that's already there, the JSON RPC work and baseline? What kind of areas in Ethereum do you think are ripe for somebody coming and starting an open source project to help build this ecosystem?
Yes, there are some folks who've approached the project governing board recently about ideas. I think again, the best way to think about it is any open source project that's out there in the Ethereum space. And actually, I should point this out, that we are Ethereum first, not Ethereum only. Okay, and that's true for the EEA in general. We are Ethereum first, not Ethereum only, and that's because our members in the community isn't, right? We all operate in a multi-chain world. And I think that's the reality, right? So if you have an open source project that works on Ethereum and you would like to make sure that that develops into a standard, then the EEA Community Projects is the place to bring it. I know I did not give a specific answer. That's because I have one big one in my mind that someone brought to me today that I can't talk about. Okay?
Oh yeah, no, I wasn't asking for sneak peek announcements, but just kind of if there were specific things that, and I like the broad-based answer, but I think it's really, is there a particular technical area that you think in Ethereum is ripe for this? Maybe you don't know.
Right. So I think it's fair to say that there are quite a number of projects that look at what builds on top of Ethereum, right? And also, how do you build from one chain to another chain? These are this is where the work is happening. Okay, there are a variety of ways that people have tried to scale Ethereum, and I think as they do that, as these multiple solutions develop, there will eventually be a need for them to work together in some way.
Right.
And in fact, if you look right now, I think bridging is one actually that is probably needed. All kinds of chains are building bridges to Ethereum right now. And eventually, I think there's going to be increased need for standardization there. There's some work that's already happened. There are some groups that have developed APIs. But I think that either those or variations of those are going to need to be adopted more broadly in order for a proper ability to transfer value from one chain to another. Because ultimately, even though I believe Ethereum is the best core foundational layer and ultimately will be the anchor chain for everything, there will be many multiple chains out in the world that then, that essentially anchor themselves to Ethereum, but otherwise fill a particular niche that Ethereum itself is not really ideal for. So I think we're just going to see more and more standardization in that respect.
And that's a great answer. And I just want to bring back around real quick again to the international aspect. I think kind of the regulatory things that you mentioned, right, around governments trying to figure out how to, now they're doing a lot of that on the cryptocurrency side, but on the core technology side, on the chain side, being able to say, hey, this is an international standard that Europe has agreed to, that Asia Pac has agreed to, that North America has agreed to, is a very valuable thing. So things that build on top of that, I think this is really a great example of you can't have one source base to rule all of these things.
That's a great ending statement. Thank you. Thank you very much, Guy. At this point, I think I'll need to hand it back to the Secretariat, but I just want to thank you for coming and talking with me and the world in this in this session.
Well, thanks, Dan. Really great to partner with you on this, and really glad we got a chance to do this.
Okay, a big thank you to Dan and Guy for joining us today. Please feel free to place your social media handles in the chat so all attendees can follow your work. For additional information about joining the EEA, please reach out to membership@int-eth-alliance.org or visit our website, and that's been pasted in the chat for you. You can also follow the EEA on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Thank you again, and this concludes today's EEA Education Series webinar.